Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ron Sanders. I'm staff director for the Florida Center for Cybersecurity, and we're hosting today's webinar as part of a series focusing on cybersecurity and other national security issues. We're doing this in partnership with a number of organizations, and today in particular, I'd like to single out and shout out one of our most important partners, and the Joint Special Operations University, part of the Special Operations Command. We actually have with us today the president of the Joint Special Operations University, Dr. Ike Wilson, who's going to be providing commentary to us later today. And also joining me as co-moderator is Dr. Golfo Alexopoulos, who's an academic with the University of South Florida and the director of USF's Russia Institute. So Golfo and I are going to interrogate Dr. Wilson, but only after he has a chance to set the stage. Today's webinar is about future threats to global security. And while we are buffeted by headlines every day about some of those threats, from the Ukraine and the Baltics to the Middle East and wherever, Dr. Wilson's going to set the stage by asking us to think about this a bit more conceptually. That'll be the first part of the program, about 15 or 20 minutes. The second part of the program, Dr. Alexopoulos and I will interrogate Dr. Wilson. We've got a series of questions based on his remarks and his theories, and we're going to talk to him about that. We hope to keep this conversational, and Ike tells us he's prepared for that. So buckle your seatbelts. That's the second part of the program. The third part, and this is where you get to participate, the third part of the program will involve questions submitted from our audience. We've got a chat room set up. We have been collecting questions since the registration site opened a couple of days ago. We have a whole series of them that we're ready to pose to Dr. Wilson and Dr. Alexopoulos. So that will be the third segment. And after about an hour, we'll close down. But we want to leave the lines open so that if you've got additional questions, you'll be able to submit them, and we'll try to respond after the program closes. So with that, why don't we start? Again, our theme today is future threats to global security. Dr. Wilson, why don't you set the stage for us and talk a little bit about some of the theories that you've been able to develop over the years. And I should add, Dr. Wilson is currently the president of the Joint Special Operations University, but he came to that job after a distinguished career as a military officer with combat tours in the Middle East, service at U.S. Central Command here in Tampa, as well as a whole host of other accomplishments, including a senior fellow for something called the New America Foundation, another one of our strategic partners. So Dr. Wilson, over to you to set the stage.
Well, first, let me just say, Dr. Sanders and Dr. Alexopoulos, Ron and Golfo, and please call me Ike as we go forward. Thanks for this opportunity. This is fantastic. I can't think of a better way of spending a lunch period, frankly, any part of my day, than to get chastised and make some provocations into any and every room that's willing to give me a little time and space to engage with folks. So I'm really looking forward mostly to the open virtual living room conversation, but I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of set a frame. So I've got some notes. I got it set up where I'll look like I'm going to be in the camera with you, but I'm going to just to kind of get a lot of information out into the air in a short period of time. And Ron and Golfo, please, if I go beyond the time we agreed to, just hit my mute button and let's get to the questions and answers. But we provided to the audience members, thanks for your time. I know everyone's time is precious, so I really appreciate the opportunity. And we preset all of you with read aheads or view aheads, as well as view afters and read afters. So that information's out there. I'm going to speak to some of that, but obviously can't get into all the details. So that information's there, and I see this as a start of an effective communication, a dialogue that we're going to, in many different forms and fashion, take forward through this series and others like it through our collaborative partnerships as they evolve. So let me get started here. And I'm going to give you a quick summary up front because I'm probably not going to get through all the points I really want to make. So I'm going to give you a summary of what I want to use as a frame right up front. And so let me just start by saying this. In order to really truly gain a comprehensive understanding and appreciation for quote unquote future threats to global security, one needs a lens. One has to have some type of lens through which to look at the global security environment. past, present, and forecasted, foresighted future. To use that lens or lenses as a device for bringing some type of logic and a sense of coherency to all the churn of change in character of geopolitical competition that defines the promise as well as the perils. But let's not forget the promise also of all this unknown in a global security and defense futures environment that we're facing today, and that we have to think forward through the next 30, 50, and I would offer outwards to the next century, 100 years. Because a lot of the things that we're dealing with today are artifacts and unintended consequences of some of the structures that we put in place 100 years ago, almost to the, in some critical respects, to the day, to the year, to the month, and in some cases to the day. Particularly when you look at compound crises like Syria and Iraq, what I call Chirac. You can ask me about that later in the Q&A. See, I'm already provoking the kind of things I really want to talk to you about. So I think what I'm going to try to do here is and give you that lens. One needs a theory of next, and that's what we call this compound security threats and compound security dilemma. Now I've been working on developing this theory of next. Frankly, I hate to say it because it just says I've been on the planet a long time, for about the past 30 plus years. You know, mixed between an Indiana Jones lifestyle of academic and when I'm not in the classroom, I'm out doing field work. A lot of those years being in uniform, many of those years as well being an academic researcher and strategic advisor in a lot of different walks of life. I'd like to speak briefly to this theory of next and share with you some of what the world of future security threats looks like when viewed through this theoretical lens of what we call, or what I'm calling, compound security dilemma. Theory in general helps us make sense of relevant historical cases and experiences of our present condition state, helping us to better understand what is truly new in our present condition state as opposed to what is only new to us because of our own lack of historical mindedness. And all that to better enable us to make reasonable, probabilistic forecasts of the future, so we can get a better understanding, appreciation of that possibilities frontier out there ahead of us. The good, the bad, and the ugly, potential trends and tendencies. I would offer strongly that only with this can we truly, really truly begin to make actionable decisions on strategies and plans of action. The United States faces a compound security threat today, reflecting a paradigm shift in the character of global geopolitical competition. Arraying these threats against liabilities in strategic and policy frameworks poses a significant yet under-acknowledged, I won't say unacknowledged, but I will say confidently so, under-acknowledged challenge. And again, that under-acknowledged challenge is something I call the new compound security dilemma. This compound security dilemma demands compound solutions and compounded approaches to those integrated statecraft solutions that recognize, that adapt, and embrace the multipolar ecosystem and its global political, cultural, economic, health, and competitive dynamics. Now, a little characterization of the environment that we live in today, and that's going to be the face of who we are and what we do and how we do it for the next at least 50 to 100 years. Today's tumultuous global security environment is best characterized as one of contagious disruptive change. What does that mean? Converging, trans-regional, compound security threats that paint and drive a pathological weakening of nation states and arguably a breakdown of the Western liberal order itself that we've lived under, and relative order, keyword relative, since at least 1945. Some arguments, and I've made them myself, can take it all the way back through the Peace Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, even outwards to the Treaty of Augsburg, 1515. So we've lived with this particular Western liberal-based order for a very long time. A mixed variety of security threats driven by cultural, political, and historical forces have combined in ways that have fundamentally altered the character of threat and the environment of global geopolitical competition, confronting U.S. policymakers with a compound security dilemma heretofore under-acknowledged. Kate, if you wouldn't mind, if you could bring up that first slide, please, so folks can see a graphic depiction of what that compound security dynamic looks like. So if you could bring that slide up for everybody, that would be great. Okay, I'm going to assume it's up. So what do I mean by compound? By compound, I'm referring to the increased interaction, or I might better describe it as an interconnectedness and a collision of otherwise once separate and separable, in some cases, policy issues that are reflective of this new post-Cold War and now post-9/11 international security environment. Two geostrategic mile markers that I intentionally put forward. We can talk a little bit about that maybe in the Q&A of why I pick on the post-Cold War transition period and the post-9/11 transition period. Now, where there was once perhaps a brighter line dividing those policy issues of a limited domestic context and scope of impact and consequence, there is today less of a relevant and viable division between the national and the international. There is no longer a so-called water's edge to the domestic and dividing the domestic from the foreign policy arenas and from those policy-making endeavors relatedly. Now, traditional security concerns over material resources, something we're very familiar with, particularly any of us out there who are global affairs, global security affairs, international relations, international affairs scholars and practitioners. We understand the traditional security dilemma in that, in terms of those material resource security concerns and those competitions. Example, access to oil, right, and other scarce resources, that predation, material predation. These are less divorceable. They haven't gone away, they've metastasized. They're less divorceable from issues of so-called human security, local concerns and challenges over food shortages, water predation, demographic changes, health concerns, human rights protections, etc. The rising threats of natural and man-made biological threats. Need I say more when I speak to pandemic flu, HIV/AIDS, etc. COVID-19. Now these kinds of threats, their metastasis, their contagion, their pandemic scope and scale and reach, make health policy, again, traditionally an issue easily relegated to domestic, so-called domestic concerns and jurisdictions. It's now a global security policy issue. Old concepts of domestic politics and policies such as environmental policy and immigration policy now take on a global context and a security context. We now must think of these policy issues and concerns in the security and defense context, i.e., environmental policy becomes environmental security policy. Immigration policy must become immigration security and defense policy. Now, what we have come to call gray zone conflicts, gray zone activities, gray zone wars even. Folks, I would offer they are nothing more than manifestations of the compound security dilemma, but also the opposite, vice versa. That the compound security dilemma is at least in part an artifact of limitations in how we as a nation and nationhoods globally view and understand and approach the following three things. First, what constitutes, and importantly, what we determine not to constitute an issue or a situation of quote unquote security versus non-security. I would say that alone speaks to some type of ideational cognitive blinder that is creating a say-do gap and a lag of our policy treatments lagging behind the changing, ever-changing, dynamically changing world that we live in and that is ahead of us. So it becomes a race against ourselves and a race against time and condition state to get in front of these compound security threats to provide an anticipatory, preferably, but at least an overmatching response that is comprehensive as the combined compounded threats are in of themselves. Second, how we are institutionally structured for planning, decision-making, and implementation. I would say that this speaks to an organizational flaw. And the great Dr. Amy Zegert out there a few years back, I'm not going to date her, wrote a wonderful book that everyone should have on their shelves, and before putting it on the shelf, read and study, that speaks to flawed by design. I think that's, as I recall, that's the name of the book, Flawed by Design, organizational institutional design flaws that within them live and persist legacy organizational cultures that create those stovepipes and those institutional separations, those say-do gaps that adversaries, including ourselves and our own cognitive gaps, end up exploiting to overwhelm relative stasis, relative order and security. Thirdly, and the third one really speaks to that organizational culture piece. how we view and value, including how we weight and prioritize an issue or a situation, that's what speaks to this flawed by design, the outcomes of it that really speaks to an organizational cultural dynamic. Now, why does all this matter to this topic and our understanding of future threats to global security? Why and how does this matter to our purposes today? Real quickly, history doesn't repeat itself. That's certainly true, but I would say that we do. That we, the people, cause history to repeat, and oftentimes in the most deleterious ways, when we fail to revisit and listen and gather history's lessons for our contemporary times. So if you bear with me for just a few seconds, I'm gonna put my Western civilizational historian's cap on. I'm gonna channel the great Thucydides a little bit and maybe set up a conditioned state where, at least in our own mind's eye, we can do the most similar case, not same, but most similar case comparison, and think about the Thucydides trap that Thucydides wrote about at the time of the actioning back then, and what the likes of Graham Allison and others have proposed as us being in another cycle of Thucydides trapping, and what that might mean, what history might be able to tell us, especially when looked through a theoretical lens. I think there's no better place to begin, at least in the greater Western civilizational sense, than with that great war amongst the Peloponnese now over 2,500 years ago. And again, Thucydides, participant, observer, and historian, chronicling of that war, the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE, right? And his seminal explanation, and this is the point I want everybody to take away in one's mind's eye, his seminal explanation for the cause of that particular great power war, that epochal war. An explanation that is endured now as a cornerstone explanation for the causes of war in general, seminal to the political science discipline of international relations. Both the English and the American schools are the same. For Thucydides, he explained the cause of the Peloponnesian War this way, and I quote, "The real cause I consider to be one which was formerly most kept out of sight at his time, the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta made war inevitable." Now, while Thucydides seemed quite certain about his closing the case on the matter of the causes of the war, historians and strategists, global affairs experts continue to debate the origins. Some of the main reasons offered in those enduring debates, I'll name four. Sparta was jealous of other powers and desired more power for itself. Okay. Second, Sparta was unhappy at no longer having all the military glory. So now we're seeing matters of the intangible, tangible factors of honor and glory coming into play here as well. Thirdly, Athens became a bully, became hubristic. Athens bullied its allies in neutral cities. There was a conflict among city-states between competing political ideologies, is a fourth sub-debate. I would offer to all of you and to all of us, myself included, always, that these additional four explanations describe the character of a changing character of geopolitical competition at and of those times that in their combinations, not singularly, but in their compounded combinations back then, perhaps reshaped the very nature of international relations between the powers of that day in ways and to a degree, scope, and scale such that the factors of both real deprivations as well as perceived relative deprivation, PRD, in the wake of a world system power transition, right, between Sparta and Athens and all of its allies, reached a point of runaway where war became, true to form, inevitable, but perhaps more of a history of their making than anything else. If there's indeed a Thucydides trap underlining and defining our own strategic competition and its potential for triggering great powers, conflicts, or even war, who and what dynamics might be setting the traps? Are they limited to a revanchist Russia and a aggressively rising China? Might the trappers also include us? And when I say us, I'm speaking the United States of America. Unintendedly, perhaps sometimes in certain contexts, intendedly so, particularly if a vital national US interest is the preservation of prior global primacy, not as a ways and means towards bringing other benefits and bounties to the world, but as an in and of itself. Is there evidence of that as we look at it through the theory of the case and the theory of next? I believe there's evidence out there that doesn't prove the point, but there is evidence there that at least should give us some confident, humble, confident caution to actually go back, revisit theory, relook history, relevant history through the theoretical lens, so we can have a better understanding of our contemporary times as we go forward. I've got a lot more to say about this. I always do. But I think I'm gonna cut myself short here. I'm gonna make a couple of more points. I'm gonna cut myself short, and then I'm gonna give, I think, a couple of points back. It might be a first time in world history that Dr. Ike Wilson's given back any time. But I wanna say a couple other things, and then Kate, if you could bring up slide 2. I just want to show the complexity of how we have to think about and how we have to approach the calculations of force as it relates to power. And the reason why I said what I just said the way I said it is that force is not power. And Newton told us this a long time ago. I know we're long beyond the laws of Newton with quantum physics and the like, but those Newtonian equations still hold in a grand ordering of the universe sense of those theories and laws. And one need look no further than Newton's equation for power. Power equals force times displacement, how you apply the behavior behind the application of force. Force times displacement over time. So any great power should, at the end of the day, be known, good, bad, and indifferent, for their power being a story of the body of their work. Again, force times displacement equals work over time, right? Good, bad, and ugly. Combinations of both. But the one thing we learn about power and force from just looking at Newton's equation is that force is an essential, necessary component of, but in and of itself, woefully, dangerously insufficient as a proxy or surrogate for power itself. They are not the same. Sometimes this Thucydides trapping of self, historically over long cycles of history, not only limited to the Western liberal traditions, but all world civilizations throughout time, millennia long cycles, long axial period cycles of change. We all tend to see those traps start taking upon their trapping aspect when those powers start to conflate force with power. Force with power. The policies of a revanchist Russia, a revisionist China, and continuing conflicts in places like Syria, Libya, and Iraq, just to name a few, instability in Venezuela, I put in that category as well, all provide compelling, geographically diverse, and comprehensive examples of the compound security threats faced by the United States and the world of communities of democracies today. I will end by this provocation. We have long been engaged in, but unwitting to, what it has been and is now taking on an accelerated metastasis, nothing less than a globalizing insurgency. And I use the term pointedly and deliberately, a globalizing insurgency against and challenging and disrupting the solvency, the relative peace and order of the longstanding Westphalian, Western liberal international relative order in the system itself. That is, if there is a greater, a bigger maps, larger war that we are dealing with, and all the trappings within it, the Thucydides trapping potentialities within it, I would say that's it. That's a provocation. It's an intentional one. It's something I've been looking at for a number of years. You know, and you start counting years and decades when you're like me and been on the planet as long as I have been. But I want to leave that provocation there. That's the rudiments of a theory of next. It's a lens, one lens. It's a combination, a combined lens of a lot of different apertures, starting with the big three from international relations, realism, neorealism, neoliberal institutionalism, and constructivism, and then a lot of other sub theories put into play as well. Field tested in a lot of different walks of life, not just military. Tried on for size. And let me pause there and turn it back over to my colleagues so we can grapple a little bit with what I've put on the table and some of the great questions I know are already flowing in. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Ike. That is very provocative. In some respects, the inimitable words of Yogi Berra come to mind. This is deja vu all over again,
You bet.
but with a 21st century twist. Golfo, what do you think? What's your reaction to what Ike has put forth?
So Ike, this was so fascinating. I'd love for you to develop some of these ideas that you presented. For example, the inability to draw sharp lines now between the domestic, the international, war and peace, this gray zone between war and peace. And it seems like there's also a difficulty in distinguishing the combatant from the civilian. If we're all, involved in this, if this is really a much broader problem than just a limited battlefield with a limited adversary. So if you could just develop those ideas, please.
Super, fantastic question. Again, it's, I'll keep everyone for our natural lifespans to really get to the essence of this. But Golfo, I'm so glad you asked the question the way you did, because you asked the question in comparison and contrast to a natural assumed given, a given start point. And that given start point is 550 years old and long and enduring. It's that Western liberal international order that the United States, for good, bad, or indifferent, combination of all three, since clearly since 1945, has been what the late great Les Gelb called in his great book, Power Rules, the United States as guaranteeing regulating power of that international system. That international system predicates relative order and peace. It defines an outer realm, what we call international relations, and distinguishes it from intra-national or internal relations. That's where we get this notion and these realities of our own making between a domestic realm and a foreign or an international realm. And those are the baseline jurisdictional boundaries, because we're trying ultimately to put the carnage of war, that ridiculously peculiar and heinous form of politics by other means, as the other great Karl von Clausewitz called it, war as a continuation of politics by other means, with a purpose to compel others to your will, right? So that's politics. But to deliberately set a playing field, if you will. And I hate to minimize matters of war and peace to a playing field, but I'm going to use the metaphor just to put some images in our heads nonetheless. Where there's an intentional, by law and convention, norms, principles, and rules, a regime, right? Rules and norms and principles, rules and decision-making processes, an international structure that defines who's a fair player, how you identify the player of war and warfare. They have to be uniform. They have to reflect and represent a flag, which is a national flag, the primacy of the nation state, the premise of a legitimate, internationally recognized statehood, nation statehood being first and foremost, more often than not, of, by, and for the people as the social compact and construct, and that government having enough force for powerful purposes to hold an effective monopoly on the instruments of violence so that they can contain democratic back and forth within the territorial boundaries of a sovereign nation state. That's where territorial sovereignty comes from, and the great sin of international relations since 1515, and truly since 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, where the great sin of aggression, where one state aggresses out of its own box, if you will, and violates the inviolable territorial boundaries of another sovereign, inviolable state. I mean, case in point, Gulf War I, with Saddam Hussein's Iraq aggressing, breaking the boundaries, violating the sovereignty of a statehood called Kuwait, clearly justified international intervention, unilateral cause justified, and a collective security action justified for going in to reestablish the status quo ante, the reestablish Kuwait's territorial sovereignty, right? Reestablish that which was prior to the aggressive act. That's about 550 years of what I call the traditional regime. What have we seen clearly since the end of the relative stability of bipolarity and mutually assured destruction through nuclear tit for tat weapons balance? Through the Cold War, with the end of the Cold War, we lose that stability. And what have we seen emerge since then? At an accelerated pace, we've seen what I call in my research an emergent regime. What we know it today as responsibility to protect, and where all of the conversations, largely normative conversations, now becoming codified in international law, international humanitarian law, which is premised on an entirely different set of ground rules. It says, for increasing cause, just cause, violate the territorial sovereignty of a state in order to address the heinous behavior of a statehood over its nationhood within those territorial boundaries, right? So the internationalization of otherwise internal conflicts is what really blurs the clearly set and intended boundaries, and that's where you start getting into everything to include who's a justified belligerent in a contestation of competing ideas, up to the point of armed conflict and war. What does a warrior look like? What constitutes a warrior? The attacks of 9/11, even prior to 9/11, 1992, in bin Laden's fatwa against the West and the United States in particular. If folks go back and read that fatwa, bin Laden, I'm not saying this is a justification for bin Laden, but that was a declaration of war, as a fatwa is. And it was given an explanation of, we don't hold those Westphalian dividing lines of who the protected person is, the civilian, and the civilian non-war activity from the war activity and the warrior. The blend, the lack of a blend has been a post-1945 architecture and an artifact of our own making. Now, I'm a firm believer in that architecture, because it has kept wars more cold than hot, and has kept us out of the international wars, though we've had horrible internal conflicts of a violent amplitude. But we have not had an international war like up to the scale of a World War II and a World War I prior to it since then, because of that architecture. Those architectures are increasingly breaking down because of the challenges coming from without, by other powers who just don't buy into that architecture. They have an alternative want and way, as well as the things that we may be doing intentionally and also unintendedly inside those rules, and how we may not be playing by our own rules, and particularly indictable in my view. And again, I'm not speaking for SOCOM or the Department of Defense or JSOU. I'm talking to you all as Dr. Ike Wilson, citizen of the United States and an academic, right? So don't hold the SOCOM and DOD responsible for what I'm already have said. But we may be setting those Thucydides traps, wittingly and unwittingly, internally, because we're doing things, we're leading a global environment, and we're being a global leading power in that really old, bad way. And any of us that are parents understand this, and grandparents understand this. You don't want to find yourself doing things in terms of, or even saying to your kids and grandkids, do as I say, not as I do. And again, I hate the metaphor of the paternalistic being brought in international relations, but you get the meaning here. We may have done things, never have been at the moment good cause, justifiable cause to do things, but we have had a heavy hand, the United States of America, the last 20 years of internationalizing otherwise internal conflicts, where the old rule said, leave to Caesar what is Caesar's. Whatever happens inside that territorial sovereign boundary is not a matter of international affairs, and unless something's crawling out of it and aggressing you don't really have a just cause for intervening. We've broken that down for, I'll share my own personal view. I think for very good, justifiable cause, but we've not gone back and had a deliberate constitutional convention to make a determination of whether those things we've had to do that have come with some of the breaking of nationhoods and statehoods as an unintended consequence, whether we can allow that to persist as our way going forward, because we may be the biggest disruptor in having a largest of the hands of inspiring and moving forward this so-called insurgency against the norms and principles and the rules and decision-making processes of the relative peace international systems-wide context that we've lived under certainly since 1945. That's where we are in the great threshold crossing of our times today. I know that's a long answer, but it's a great framer.
So Ike, I'm going to provoke you in turn, and Golfo, I'm going to ask you to respond as well. And maybe there's a short answer.
I'll try to keep it. They'll get shorter and shorter, I promise.
Well, I don't think this lends itself to a short answer, so I'm going to ask anyway. But Golfo and Ike, are you suggesting, Ike, that nation states are obsolete, at least when it comes to compound security? That the nature of the problems are so multipolar, multidimensional, that boundaries are an obsolete artifact? Is that what you're suggesting here?
I think the question I'm going to answer your question directly. I'm going to dance around a little bit. You know, I represent special operations. We are experts, exquisite experts at the indirect approach. So I'm going to dance around, but I promise you, I'm going to dive right into it. I think whether or not the nation state as a very particular, again, statehood, there have always been and always will be statehoods, right? The suffix is always there, whether it's a city state, a theocratic state, territorial states, empires, which is a form of a territorial state. The nation state, it's all in the prefix. The prefix changes, right? The nominator changes. And the United States of America is the first of this current dominant form of statehood in international relations. Not the only form, but the current dominant form. Since our own revolution, the French to follow. So I will say that right up front. So whether or not that nation state becomes obsolete is a matter of our choice. It's a matter of our choice. Now, that choice is bounded within realities of a changing, ever-changing international environment and other competitors and other statehood competitors that are back on the table, back out and competing, right? To include what we call today the non-state actor. I think a lot of things that we put in the broad rubric of the non-state actor, false. That's not a non-state.
Is that because they're proxies?
It's a differently ordered statehood, or at least they're intending towards it. The Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State, I hate to call it that. That's why I always preface the so-called Islamic State, right? Because they're trying to get back to a particular form of statehood, centuries back, right? Their means of approaching it, heinous and horrible, and the violation of a peaceful world religion called Islam is an abomination in terms of a violation of the Westphalian Order, of norms and principles and rules of decision-making procedures that are viable and legitimate by a collective determination by the players on the field of the moment, of the era. What do I think is obsolete? I think what is obsolete are unilateral approaches to solutions to what are compound security dilemmas. So I put on the table as a proposition, a solving agent for my theory, nothing less than multilateralism will solve. This idea of nice to have allies and friends, with and through, by, with and through, as some call it, not a nice thing to have, an imperative if you want to quote unquote win. And part of winning is reestablishing and fortifying, strong pointing, rebuilding resilience and resistance within those nation statehoods. Help them to make themselves legitimate and right from within, so they're less exploitable from without. And we have to do this. I don't mean this to come from religious tones, but it comes from the secular world as well. But we have to really adopt the imperative yes answer to the question, are we our nation states, brothers and sisters, keepers in order to keep ourselves? For me, after studying and practicing this for 30 plus years, I think the answer is unblinkingly. I haven't blinked yet. Yes, definitively so. The power equation will not equate without that displacement variable of the equation. More multi-compositional forms of force employed or displaced, put into play more multilaterally, not hubristically and unilaterally over a long period of time. It's like an IRA investment in self. Severe penalties for early withdrawals and going it alone. But if we have the strategic patience and the dollar cost average investments along with a lot of others, in about 30 years time, it yields exponential benefits. Those are the kinds of calculations that are required to overmatch, not just match, but overmatch a worldless compound security dilemma and the compound security threats that define it and describe it.
We can't think of ourselves as islands unto ourselves. We have to think about ourselves as part of a larger global security ecosystem.
Ron, that's exactly right. On that, just real quick, I promise. I really encourage folks to go and read a couple of those papers, the peer review papers on compound security, because Ron, your point you just made, that's the inherent fundamental paradox within the compound security dilemma. That's one of the things that makes it a dilemma. The paradox that the world has turned, it's less of the traditional set of balance of power contestations, that in more of a return, I call it a neo-mercantilism world. We've gone back to the future. It's really, for most similar case comparisons, you have to look prior to World War I in the 18th and 19th century and further back, in the types of competitions, great, middle, and small, and the nature of those contestations, who the players were. It was a lot more beggar thy neighbor, economic predation based. It was more beggar thy neighbor. It was more transactional, what Richard Haas and others call a self-help approach to. So a dynamic that drives you more in the geopolitical, geostrategic fetal position, the tendency, the natural tendency to go into oneself as a single unilateral power, and to define the world only in your form, and to approach solutions unilaterally. That metastasizes a wicked problem. It further metastasizes a compound security threat. So the paradox is it drives you right at the moment where we need imperatively to go more into coalitions of willing and able partnerships and consortium collaborations. The dynamics are such, the natural environmental dynamics are such that it drives us in the opposite direction. We have to recognize that first and then do a deliberate force fight against our natural tendencies as nation states, where the natural tendency is to leave coalitions, leave partnerships. We have to fight against that to go more into them. We have to triple down. We have to double down on Westphalia. We've got to double and triple down on the Westphalian Compact. I'll pause there. Thanks for the extra time on that one.
No. That's very insightful. Golf, I'm going to give you a chance to respond, and then we do have a couple of questions that our audience has submitted, including one, Ike, for you that is really, really hard. So buckle your seatbelt. After Golfo gets her say, I'll pose that question to you. So be ready.
Oh boy, thanks for scaring me early there, Ron. Thanks.
Ike, I just want to follow up very quickly on something that you said. So what is the role then of the United Nations? Let's say we work together with allies. It's one thing to work with allies that are like-minded, that agree that the liberal Western order has, involves values that are really important, human rights and so on. But what do we do in an environment where we've got a Security Council that cannot agree, where we have fundamental differences between the great powers, where we have gridlock? Then what? How do we collaborate with those with whom we have very few shared values?
Great question. You actually, we're simpatico on some of the answer you already placed in part of the question you laid out. That I share with you, and I'm gonna just try to put a little bit. I'm gonna try to put a little bit more meat on the bones you've already laid out in terms of what I think is the answer to your question. Let's first understand that international institutions like the UN, especially the UN, hard-fought failure in the peace that came out of the intended constructed peace, the treatment coming out of the Great War, the war to end all great wars, intendedly so. The League of Nations. That was a recipe, a solution put forward to solve the pandemic of war. And We failed. Where did it fail? It failed in the so-called domestic politics within the power, the great power of the United States within the Senate. It couldn't get Senate ratification, right? So that wasn't an international threat that killed the solution to the last international great power war. The seed corn, the killing blow came from the domestic policies within. We're going to get to that, I know, and hopefully in some of the follow-on questions. But what's going on in the domestic, so-called domestic realms of all the nation states, particularly the community of democracies and democratic states, I would say if someone asked me what the greatest threat to world order is today, it's that. It's the threat. It's the demise of the domestic democratic state, nation state, in that social compact. But back to the UN. So particularly UN, but UN representing all international regimes that came out of the two great epochal wars of recent history, World War I and World War II, which I'm one who says it's one big war. I'm with Philip Bobbitt that says that, you know, we start there prior to 1914, and we bring it all the way up to the other piece of Paris in 1990, and what the parliamentarian states that won the war of isms against Nazism and communism, structured communism, and the determinations that we made past then, and that's a whole different story. But let's first, so I've already made the first point on the UN. I mean, my whole time on planet, it's always been an indictment against the United Nations, right? Great in terms of concepts of, you know, why and how can we get along, right? But a lot of blaming of the United Nations and other international institutions of, yeah, you're not paying your fair dues, you come in, you know, too little, too late for not long enough, you know, all those indictments. But then I have to say, hey, I'm pointing a finger out at the UN as an international institution. I've got three fingers pointing back at me, the nation state. Those international institutions are only as good as we make them as the primary actor on the international relations playing field, called the individual nation states, right? So that's part of, if we want those international institutions to bring more overmatching compound wins for the collective good, we've got to, as individual nation states, collectivize. That's how you rebalance and get the power equation to re-equate. So the blame is on us, right? As individual nation states, to fail to really embrace multilateralism as a must do, not a nice to do, when it's in our own self-interest. The other piece of this is we allow, in that same vein, these institutions to reify. What was right when it was constructed perhaps by a big five defining the Security Council, the world has changed, it's more compounded. If you even buy half of if you even find my theory carrying a little bit of the explanatory water, okay, if it's a compound war, then it requires compound approaches. The institutions probably need to be re-looked at from their constitutional design, and we've got to widen the aperture and make the UN and Security Council pointedly more small d democratic. When it becomes a totalitarian architecture, an autocratic architecture, who are we enabling? We're enabling and we're empowering with great power, with great force. The so-called great powers of a revanchist Russia and a rising aggressively rising China with more power than they actually can bring to the table themselves. So I think we just recalibrate a lot of the institutions, that is the Westphalian order brought forward institutionally. You unveil the truth. You pull back the curtain. I'm going to switch metaphors. You pull back the curtain and you reveal the real wizard behind the curtain, the real Wizard of Oz, right? Which is a crazy little character who thinks of past moments of genuine great power moments that are long past and never to really be recovered because they don't have the attributes to do it themselves without being autarkic in the doing. I think if we do those things and reinvest in ourselves collectively as a community of democracies, we win. China, as long as the United States and the community of democracies can say this, in contrast to a revanchist Russia and a aggressively rising China, we win. A lot of battles between now and then. Unfortunately, a lot of blood and treasure loss between then, but it's almost like a Churchillian April 1942 moment where you look at the map and said, okay, game over already. Checkmate. it's going to take 3 years of 35 moves, but we can only lose if we lose ourselves. We make a wrong move. I think as long as we can say the following thing, and I'll pause, that the United States and community democracies have and deal with partners and partnerships where Russia, the likes of Putin's Russia and Xi's China, only have transactional clients. When it comes down to that, we win. If we do the wrong thing and turn real true to form partnerships into only transactional relationships, we're slowing down in the race to great power so that our less worthy competitors who could never compete with us to catch up and beat us. So I'll pause there.
Well, Ike, I think you've given us an idea for another webinar, maybe one that's a couple of
Love
hours long. Just
Love
think
it.
of the challenge of reimagining the United Nations. What is
Absolutely.
the United Nations 2.0?
We have to do nothing less than a constitutional convention, certainly here at home in the United States, but in the larger scale, we got to re-look and reconsider the Constitution of us, big US, all of us. We have to do that. If we don't do it, the environment and the disruptor challengers are already doing it to us. We need to be the masters of our own destiny going forward as an international community.
And the politics of that make my head hurt. Let me make your head hurt.
Oh, no.
I think we probably only have time for one question from the audience, but it's an important one. Ike, this is my characterization, not yours, but you're a warrior scholar. And I think our viewers would like to know what led you to this? What led you to this station in life, given your career? And also, if they want to follow in your footsteps, what advice would you give them?
Oh, wow, that's great. And especially that last piece, if you want to follow my footsteps, follow in better footsteps than mine. I'm gonna start, and anyone who knows me for a long time, even relatively briefly, they know that I've always carried a credo. It goes back to May of 1784, I believe, in a letter written by John Adams to his wife Abigail Adams, and that's where he wrote, and I'll just do a quick excerpt, and I've amended it myself because I have a daughter as well as sons. But he said, I must study politics and war so that my sons and daughters have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. And then the quotation goes further to the next generation of posterity, intended posterity, right? That's always, anyone has known me for a few months, if not years, that's my credo. I've always, and that really captures the essence of it. I think my own father is a 30-year uniformed military professional. I come from a very long line of servants to nation, uniformed, most of them uniformed. Those who weren't did it in federal civil service. So we're all, so part of the answer is it's in my DNA, it's in my bloodstream. But my dad, 30-year war veteran, lied about his age. It went into World War II at 16. Served in both theaters, the Pacific and the European theater. From there, Korea, and then 2 tours in Vietnam. Retired because they made him from the uniform, and the next day went back to work in the same capacity he was doing before as a civilian civil servant for another 12 years before he passed away. Mother, 50+ year, spouse and supporter of all of her kids. Myself, my sister was a Vietnam wave with the Navy. Back then during the war, the Vietnam War period. So the military piece, the warrior piece is always there. Again, that John Adams quotation, that really expanded my understanding of what it means to be a warrior, right? If I only define who I am as a warrior in a traditional sense, I would say that's really only being a battlist, only someone who throws around military force in a traditional, kinetic, lethal way. But that's not war. War is a continuation of politics by other means, last resort, not first and only resort. And so I had to figure out, once I had signed up to go to West Point and get into the profession, become a leader in the profession of war, to be the manager of the nation's arm of violence. It's got to be more than the arm of violence. It's got to be for something. And that's the political object, right? Never divorce the military object from the political object. For when you do so, you create something complete that you create something that's completely pointless and devoid of all sense. That's Clausewitz. So my intent once I put the uniform on was to assure that I and those who I mentored and led and hopefully inspired did not only define themselves by the military instrument, by the force of arms, but instead define themselves by the purpose of their service, which is we the people, the Constitution, the blood oath that we swear, uniformed and non-uniformed, all of us who serve in a federal capacity swear that oath, and I take the oath very seriously. I was at the University of Kentucky coming out of high school studying to be a biomedical engineer. And it was like a lightning bolt one day. I was doing great in courses. I didn't run off to the Army because I was not able to pass my classes. I was doing really well. But I just kind of imagined myself, 20, 30, 40, 50 years forward. I didn't see myself, for me, in that lab coat. I saw myself kind of compelled, and undoubtedly it was, my forefathers and foremothers, haunts of them bringing me forward, as well as my own study and appreciations of what it really means to be a warrior. A warrior is a peacemaker. A warrior is a peacemaker. And blessed be they. They'll inherit the earth, right? The political object of the utility of military force. The study of that, therefore, means I've got to become a global, what I define myself as a global public affairs professional, right? And that's been my life ever since. I'll end with this, for all of you out there. Let me say I'm very envious of you. I'd like to start over and do it all over again. I'm very envious of the world that you have in front of you, right? You have a hero's journey ahead of you, because we're at a threshold crossing. I'm going to channel the great John Campbell here, and the hero of 1,000 faces. If you haven't read that book, young scholars, young leader doers, you got to go out there and read that book, and including The Power of Myth and everything else. But you're at a threshold crossing. Folks like me and Dr. Sanders and Dr. Alexopoulos, our role is now to be the mentor to you, be an exemplar of the challenges that lie ahead, promise and peril, but you got to take both. You got to cross the threshold crossing. We're here to advise you and give you as much of advice, but ultimately it's your decision to cross the threshold, go into the extraordinary world, find the new elixir to our current and future problems, own it. If you can't find it, make it, right? And then bring that back to the current ordinary world so we can overcome compound security threats, right? So I've added to John Campbell's piece. My apologies to the late, great John Campbell. But my advice to you, follow your own passion, right? You get bombarded by a lot of different advice. Take the advice of mentors and folks you trust. Listen to everybody, including those you don't trust, right? Take ownership for what you're responsible for, not just the rights that are imbued upon you, especially if those of you who are American citizens and have the great privilege of living in a country like this and all the accoutrements that come with it. Take all that in with humble confidence, and then make your own darn decisions, right? And know that in your world, not mine, you're gonna don't look at this as one life choice. You all are gonna have 10 to 20 different so-called, what we would consider in my generation, separate definable careers. Again, if the world we just talked about, challenges and opportunities, boundary spanning and boundary breaking, why would not your own professional service lives and careers and combinations of both be the same? Embrace it. Don't fall prey to the concerns and the worry and the stressors of, I don't know what the one thing I want to be and do is. You're probably stressing over it because it's not one thing. We live in a world where the conjunction to buy into and to devote yourself to is the and conjunction, not the or. It's be an and person, not an or person. When you're facing an or positions, you've lost and squandered the initiative to define the meanings of war and peace and everything in between, future forward for ourselves. We are the masters of our own destiny, individually and collectively. Devote yourself to that, whether you go the private sector or the public, so-called public. If you buy anything that I put on the table, those are almost falsehood dividing characterizations. Just devote yourself to a lifetime of leadership, being a leader of character, for a lifetime of service to something noble and greater than yourself.
You know,
And whatever that looks like, that's for you to decide and to embrace. Yeah.
It seems to me that what you're saying is that while there are multiple paths to an end, the common denominator is this core value of selfless service.
I think it is.
If you've got that in your DNA, then whatever path you take, you're going to get to the kind of station in life that allows you to do what you're doing. Golfo, I'm going to give you the last word before I thank everybody and close out the event. So over to you.
Well, I just want to thank Ike and thank you too, Ron. This was really a wonderful, wonderful event, and I really appreciated it, especially what you said for our students who are listening, Ike. I'm sure they're going to learn a lot from what you just said. It was just wonderful.
Thank you both so much. Thanks to everyone in the audience. And again, I'm hoping this, and I anticipate this we'll make it so. This is the start of a running conversation with all of us, including all of you in the virtual living room. Yeah, go forward. You know, keep calm and carry on.
You've certainly asked more questions of us and given us answers. So
yes.
I think there's plenty of fodder for continuing the conversation. So Dr. Wilson, thanks so much for your service and for your remarks today. Golfo, thanks again for you and the Rush Institute co-sponsoring this with JSOU and Cyber Florida. Thanks everybody for listening, and stay tuned. There'll be more events like this to come.
Wonderful.
Thanks again.
Cheers.
Thanks everybody.